Georgia, there are two major political parties. Now, we've already focused on how the Republican Party is changing. So now it's time we take a look at the left side of the aisle at the Democrats to see what changes and shifts are happening in that party and how those very same changes could affect Georgia. But in order to understand that, we need some context. My name is Joseph and this is AJC in Context. Georgia has been a hotbed for political action recently. With the runoffs deciding which party grabbed a majority in Congress, Georgia politics matter. And not only for the people who live here, but for the nation as a whole. Political reporter Tia Mitchell will be here to break down the changes that are happening with the Democrats in the U.S. Senate. And then Greg Bluestein, another one of our wonderful political reporters, will be here to talk to us about the governor's race and how things stand statewide. Tia, thank you so much for joining us today. We are in person. Okay, so my first question for you is, what do you think the motivating issues are for people who tend to vote for Democrats?
Well, I think for Democrats or Republicans, a lot of voting goes with the pattern. So
Right.
If your parents voted Democrat or Republican, you tend to vote Democrat or Republican. And then once you start voting for people in a certain party, it's pretty hard for you to change. It happens, but for the most part, you'll stick with that party. Now, for the people who are persuadable or maybe a new voter who's trying to figure it out, beyond those kind of surroundings and upbringing, generally speaking, if you're going to vote Democratic, you're more interested in having government make sure it meets the needs of people, particularly people who are poorer or disabled or are more reliant on public services. You agree that that's the role of government, to meet the needs of people and fill in the gaps.
Right.
If you're a Republican, you're more apt to believe in things like the government should stay out of people's business as much as possible, and just kind of leave everyone alone. And as a result, taxes should be low, government should be small, because you don't need a lot of money if government's not doing a lot. So those are like the basic ideological differences.
Reverend Warnock is facing a real election soon. Is he likely to face a primary challenge? And if so, what political posturing is most likely for that?
So I don't think Reverend Warnock will face a serious primary challenger.
Mm-hmm.
It's a Senate seat and it's very easy to run for office.
Right.
So I think there may be other names on the Democratic ballot.
Mm-hmm.
But I doubt that there will be anyone who truly gives Warnock a run for their money, because he has such widespread support. Viable candidates would have a hard time raising money and would also be pressured by the party apparatus to stand down.
Right.
That being said, so the people who run against Warnock, might say I'm more progressive than them, or might run on a strict ideology. They might run on Green New Deal, mm-hmm. or defund the police or something, or they might run more moderate and say, because Warnock has been pretty progressive thus far. Right now he's talking about voting rights. He's made it clear he's okay with ending the filibuster, because he says voting rights are the biggest priority, not preserving that Senate tradition. Of course, he supported the American Rescue Plan, that latest round of COVID relief, which was very progressive in its policies. So there's no evidence right now that Warnock is anything but a more progressive Democrat right now. That doesn't mean, during the election, people will try to characterize him as one way or another. But that didn't work. Senator Loeffler, called him radical, liberal. And he, even though he faced those attacks in the campaign, he won, and he's not shying away from still embracing, again, not super progressive. He hasn't said he supports the Green New Deal. He hasn't said he supports defunding the police. He hasn't said he supports, universal basic income or Medicare for all. So it's all, those are the things that are way left, way mm-hmm. progressive. But I don't think he'll have a serious challenge in the primary.
So how do you think this will impact Georgia elections, and do you think something will happen between now and 2022 when the next election happens to not make that a thing? Like, tell me how you think about
So
that.
there's still a lot up in the air about Georgia's new election law. Basically, there are 3 lawsuits now, and it's going to take a few months to see if those lawsuits are gaining traction. And what I mean by that is you're going to have some preliminary hearings, and the Republican leaders of the state are going to ask a judge to dismiss the lawsuits, say they don't have merit, say they don't have the standing. And so some of these early court hearings, if the judges say, no, I'm not going to dismiss these lawsuits, I think, it needs to go to trial and let each side make its case. That's going to pose more trouble for Georgia's laws than if the judge says, well, no, I don't think these lawsuits have merit, and gets rid of them quickly. Along these lines, the judge could say, the Democrats are going to say, while we wait for these lawsuits to move through the process, I want you to keep the state from implementing the new law. And again, the judge can say, yep, I believe that these lawsuits are likely to win in court. So yeah, I'm going to keep the law from being implemented while the cases are going through the process, and that will slow down implementation of the law. The judge can also say, I'm not so sure you're going to win, so I'm going to go ahead and let the law be implemented. For example, the heartbeat bill that is still going through the court system, but a judge has kept Georgia from implementing the law because the judge has said some of these legal challenges might end up having merit, which is why even though the heartbeat bill was passed over a year ago, it still hasn't been implemented in Georgia. So the same thing could happen with the election law. Also, we know that the federal government, Congress, and Democrats in Congress, with the backing of President Biden, are looking at federal election changes that could affect Georgia's ability to implement the state law. So again, that's still early. Right now, that bill, there are 2 bills. One is called the For the People Act. Another bill is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And the House has passed the For the People Act, and it's just a matter of time before the House passes the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. But in the Senate, with the filibuster, right now things are on hold. And so, but if the Senate figures out a way to either get enough Republicans to pass the bill, which is not very likely, or decides they're unified in getting rid of the filibuster, which is, it's not a done deal, but looks like something could be done. And if those bills get passed in some way, then you'll again see effects in Georgia, because the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, for example, would require certain states, Georgia likely to be among them, that have a history of discriminatory election laws. When they want to change their election laws, they have to get what you call pre-clearance, which means you have to go to the Department of Justice, the federal courts, and justify why you want to change your laws. And they have to give you pre-clearance to say, okay, go ahead and do it, which is, that is not the case right now, because in 2013, the Supreme Court basically said pre-clearance was outdated and got rid of it, which is why now states like Georgia can change their laws in the way that the legislature did this year.
Right.
Before 2013, the law would have had to then be reviewed before the state could implement it. And so if the Democrats pass their bills and bring that back, that would again create a new layer of oversight before Georgia could implement this law they just passed.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but that first oversight was from Jim Crow in the 1965 Civil Rights Act.
The Voting Rights Act,
Yes.
yes. So yes, it was a provision of the Voting Rights Act that states that had a history of discrimination against Black people
Right.
had to have pre-clearance. And eventually what happened is, that was 1965, and the Voting Rights Act would be reauthorized, most recently by George W. Bush, after Congress passed bills and sent it to him. But in 2013, Shelby County in Alabama sued the Department of Justice. Eric Holder was the Attorney General at the time, and said, it hasn't been reauthorized, and we're still being held accountable for 1965 Alabama. That's not fair. We're 2013 Alabama. Look at all these ways we've come a long way. Is it fair for us to still have to do pre-clearance? In the Supreme Court, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically said, no, we can't just let a 1965 law keep holding you accountable. So it put the onus back on Congress to say, once the Supreme Court ruled, it was on Congress to say, if you want this to still happen, pre-clearance, pass a new law.
Right.
Update your requirements, update how you decide which states face pre-clearance or not. And since 2013, that has not happened.
Right. Thank you for coming. I really, really appreciate it, especially in person. It's great to actually see you.
Yeah, same. Glad to be here.
Greg, thank you for being here.
Of course.
Second time here. I think you are officially a friend of the show.
Yes.
So we're going to start off with some Stacey Abrams talk. So assuming she runs for governor again, what will be different than last time? How is the political landscape shifted? Because the focus video was the changing Democratic Party. So what would have changed between her last run and now if she does run again?
Yeah, Stacey Abrams likes to talk about proving the theory of a case.
Okay.
And you could say that in 2018, she almost got there.
Yeah.
Remember, in 2014, Democrats lost in landslides to Republicans, 8 points. That in politics, 8 points is pretty much a shellacking, right? And before that, it was even bigger. So Stacey Abrams was able to show that Democrats going on a progressive ideology can come within a whisker of winning, and then in 2020 and in 2021, they actually won. So I think the biggest difference is that she won't have to prove to Georgia voters and to donors and to national figures that it can be done, that Georgia can be flipped, because Georgia already has flipped.
Right. And I think that kind of goes into my next question too. So when Dems do win in Georgia, what kind of Democrats do they tend to be? Are they more moderate, centrist Democrats, or would you label them more progressive Democrats?
10 years ago, 5 years ago, Democrats ran as moderates in Georgia. You had gubernatorial candidates touting the fact that they were NRA Democrats.
Right.
You had Democrats who talked about, very consensus-oriented issues like expanding Medicaid and boosting healthcare funding, boosting education funding, things that, it's hard for the polls showed a general population supported. But Abrams helped usher in a sort of new brand of Democrats. They also talked about those things that have broad support, but they also embraced more liberal ideas, criminal justice overhauls, minimum pay wage increases, voting rights expansions, even some more controversial proposals like Stone Mountain overhaul, things like those that you would not hear candidates talk about that long ago. So you're definitely seeing an effort by Democrats now to go to the left, but also keep their support in the middle. I mean, look, it's worked for them too, right? That's why Metro Atlanta has flipped. Counties that like Gwinnett and Cobb that were firmly Republican for decades have switched for the first time since Jimmy Carter's presidency during the Trump era.
We know that for more federal seats, they tend to be more purple. Like in Georgia, some Democrats, some Republicans. But in the state house, we see it very much still controlled by Republicans. Do you see that changing in 2022?
No. And there's a good reason for that. Because the state house, the Republican-controlled legislature with a Republican governor, they have the final say on how to draw their own districts after the census. So what will happen later on this year is state lawmakers will go back to the Capitol It just ended. I mean, we're talking
Right.
like hours after the session ended, but there's another session, a special session later on this year, probably in late fall, where they'll draw their own political lines. And you better believe that Republicans in charge of drawing their lines are not going to draw a map that's overly friendly to Democrats.
Right.
So I expect it to be somewhat the same balance of power, maybe 105 or so seats for Republicans and 75 or so seats for Democrats in the state house, and about the same sort of mashup in the state Senate. So, look, and that's the power. That is why 2020 elections down the ballot were so important for both parties too, is because as much attention as the U.S. Senate races got and the presidential contest got, and of course they're super important, those legislative races also help define the balance of power going into this redistricting session.
Right, and I think that's I think an understated power of the governor too. That person gets to decide, or has to sign off on all of these maps. So I mean, that could really tip the balance of power. With the state purpling, do you think this will encourage more lawmakers to work across the aisle, or does this mean that they'll just appeal to the more extreme elements of their base?
It's a great question, because the vast majority of provision of measures that come before the General Assembly, they're generally like overwhelmingly supported by both parties. But the measures that tend to get more attention, and we're talking the voting measures, the gun measures, the culture wars measures, even the budget, they're very divided.
Right.
And then there's a reason why that they get more attention, is because they tend to have broader impact too on voters. And so I think when it comes to the hot button issues, there's very large divides. Whereas for the less controversial, more common sense type issues, common ground type issues, I should say, they're overwhelmingly supported by the broad majority of the Georgia legislature.
So once again, thank you for coming in person. It's always great to see you and actually have a person here. So yeah, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.